I was in the middle of interviewing Chuck from the gymnastics course, and we lost power at my house. No joke, lost power at my house. Everything shut down, screen went black, lost Wi-Fi, and it just died.
Growing up in it, not being inherently good at it, not being inherently built
Mm-hmm.
for it, it's very, very easy for me to be very empathetic to the struggle that gymnastics presents.
Well, that was one of the specific reasons I wanted to have you on, is not only do I think gymnastics in general needs more attention in my humble opinion, a world that seems to revolve mostly around the barbell. The barbell seems to reign supreme, that I don't believe conditioning, gymnastics, and there are some other incredibly critical elements of fitness that can be largely neglected, or, people are leaving a lot of fitness on the table and they may not
Oh
even
yeah.
realize that. All right, the gymnastics course is trying. Ah,
I can't wait to shin my. There we are.
unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, if
That's okay.
eventually this will get posted as the first video and nobody will know what actually just happened, but Chuck and I have been chatting for about 20, 25 minutes when all of a sudden we actually had some incredible high winds out where I live, and we lost power at my house. Everything shut down, screen went black, and it just was all gone. All gone.
It
The
wasn't meant
wonders,
to be, but
the
now we have a
wonders
chance
of
to
live.
rebuild it.
The
Bigger,
wonders of
better.
going live. So we'll start again. We'll recap where we were. So this will be one encapsulated video that I can put on YouTube, make a podcast out of it, where everyone can have all the info in one place. So, Chuck, who are you? What are your credentials, sir?
Who am
What
I?
is it that you know anything about gymnastics?
I found this shirt at the airport a few
Perfect.
years back, and it turns out that as a community, we're so bad at gymnastics, I could just get away with anything as long as I was loud and talk fast. No, so got into CrossFit many, many years ago now, but actually moved officially into calling myself a CrossFitter, and really, I think, changing my identity to all that. And we can talk about that later maybe, but that was 2008 is like when I really bought in and started following the main site. I still have a workout log that exists on the main site message boards.
Nice.
That is how I met Jeff Tucker, who was formerly the SME for CrossFit Gymnastics, and that's how I met my now wife, Vanessa Bennington. Well, it was not Bennington at the time. I made it Bennington.
There you go. There you go.
So back in 2008, man, like you didn't have the luxury of making a sweet little like 30-minute to 4-hour drive to go to a CrossFit seminar. Turns out, unless you lived in a handful of cities on the planet, it was a flight. And so my flight was from Sarasota, Florida, where I was at the time, to Fort Worth, Texas, which was where GSX was. Ended up making that trip again a few months later to go to the weightlifting course out there after I'd done my L1. And then by July of that year, I had moved out there, relocated, and started coaching CrossFit. Started just as a Gen Pop class coach with the early AM classes that nobody wants to coach, and looked up about a year later and was coaching most of the classes, almost all the classes, and I was the director of operations for Tucker while he really built the gymnastic course in the early days. That would eventually be my segue into being on the seminar side of things. Is 2011, he came back and he's like, I think I'm about done. And I was like, is it really that bad? And if any of you guys have ever traveled for work, traveling for work is a little bit different than funsies for travel.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just burned out. And so, having a business, having 3 kids, a wife, and then traveling, I think the year that like really kind of broke him from wanting to do it as like a solopreneur with it was almost 50 seminars. So like Thanksgiving and Christmas off, a few other weekends off, but he was doing midweek military courses, which used to be like a much bigger deal. So just basically like lived on the road for almost a year. And it was enough, I think, for him to kind of reevaluate like that it was time to add some other humans to the mix. And so started interning and assisting there. And I will always, always forever be super grateful to Jeff for opening the door to me to this, because I think going back to your original question, like who am I and how did I get here? I feel as though in many ways I'm one of the least deserving people in the community to be in the position that I'm in. just as a former fat kid, non-athlete with no gymnastic background, it's very surreal to have been able to, at this point, spend like nearly a decade in it. But I think that not growing up in it, not being inherently good at it, not being inherently built for it, it's very, very easy for me to be very empathetic to the struggle that gymnastics presents.
Well, that was one of the specific reasons I wanted to have you on, is not only do I think gymnastics in general needs more attention in my humble opinion, a world that seems to revolve mostly around the barbell. The barbell seems to reign supreme, that I don't believe conditioning, gymnastics, and there are some other incredibly critical elements of fitness that can be largely neglected, or, people are leaving a lot of fitness on the table and they may not even realize that. And when we had chatted, kind of setting up this interview, I really like how you mentioned something that a lot of athletes, a lot of CrossFitters seem to be quite knowledgeable and quite tuned in as to how the body develops, be it physically and neurologically, to improve what happens when the barbell's in my hand. But those skills, or that knowledge base, seems to be potentially a bit lacking with development of body weight movements. And I was hoping you could kind of take us down that road a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. We are very, very quick to overcomplicate gymnastics. And that's not saying that like simple is easy. Anybody that's been around this game for a while, or like life in general, knows that simple is not easy. But our lowest level of understanding of gymnastics is, I think, where we've gone wrong as a community in willingly making it more complicated and difficult than it needs to be. So like if I asked you, how would you define gymnastics? What would you say, like, if I was like, well, what is gymnastics?
I would say moving your body through space.
Cool. I'm happy with that. And that's because, like, you've had to define that many times. But, like, when I go to teach a seminar, the awkward tension and pause in the room, and I'm like, well, what is gymnastics? It goes dead fucking silent. I'm like, well, you guys certainly spent a lot of money and spent a lot of time traveling to do something that you're not really even sure of. And so usually, like, eventually somebody spits out a definition that's like, articulating your body through space and time while simultaneously opposing gravity and rotational forces with elements of leverage. And you're like, holy shit, dude, it's moving your body.
Wow.
But, like, you've been there and you know it.
Sure, yeah.
Like, we look at weightlifting, and I think it's because we're used to selling it to the client experience, like either as athletes or coaches, and whether it's talking to, somebody coming to sign up for the gym or trying to tell your mom, like, what CrossFit is that you do, and you talk about weightlifting, and you're like, well, yeah, it's a deadlift, but it's not a deadlift, it's just picking something up off the ground.
Sure, right.
And so we find these other ways with weightlifting to very, very, simply build constructs of how people understand at the most, like, framework basic level, and we don't even think about that with gymnastics. So, yeah. Gymnastics is just moving your body. And if we do believe that gymnastics is just moving your body, then we can look at, like, foundationally, how do your brain and your body conspire together to do movement?
Mm-hmm.
And we figure that out really well with weightlifting out of necessity. And we just take it for granted with gymnastics. So if you look at when we build weightlifting, like, we build isolated positions, and then we move through those isolated positions, identifying the correct sequence and range. And that's how we learn. And then we load that over time. And you move somebody from snatching PVC to snatching an empty bar to snatching, 100 kilos. And the shapes never changed. The sequence never changed. The range of motion never changed. We only added the other variable of load or intensity, however you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And we just don't think in those terms with gymnastics.
So what would be a nice user-friendly example for everybody at home as to how, because what you said with the barbell snatch and a PVZ, eventually loading, that makes sense. So how do we play that game with a body weight movement?
Well, prior to, like, COVID adventure time of 2020, it was a lot of spotting at the courses, but turns out that, like, traveling around the globe to get handsy with strangers has kind of been, like, weird for COVID. But I think it's just buying into understanding progression versus scaling. And that's a whole separate conversation that we can definitely talk about. But looking for opportunities that you have to replicate the movements in full with external objects. And I think this is where so much of the gymnastic world has missed what we've been able to do as CrossFitters. And I I take nothing away from the gymnastic world. Those guys are awesome, but they miss so many awesome opportunities for movement development and learning because they're given a very easy situation to work with, and that like the majority of the athletes that they build earliest level of progression, they're young kids. Like, you know, what
Right.
kind of body composition does a 4-year-old have? What kind of injury and surgery history does a 4-year-old have? How many bad habits ingrained do they have? And so we don't have the luxury of starting with something that's easy to spot, easy to move, moves well with anything, weightlifting or gymnastics.
Mm-hmm.
And so we figured out the right way with weightlifting pieces with older clients, and with gymnastics, we just slam our head against the walls because we don't think in the same terms. So getting to your original question of like, how could we approach this? Let's look at a kipping pull-up. I feel like a kipping pull-up is probably like the most foundationally classic CrossFit movement.
Sure.
So what are the elements that we have? We have a hollow, we have an arch, we have creating an active shoulder and an active grip on the bar. We have the shape change of moving from the hollow to the arch and back on the bar with an active shoulder, with active grip. We have the elements of like a gymnastic pull. And all that comes together as a kipping pull-up, but we don't look at isolating each of those pieces individually. And so, you know, I think like making it a little bit more concrete and tangible, bringing it back to like, even like Fran, you know, you got clients that want to do 21 unbroken pull-ups in Fran. Let's look at these isolated elements. Can you just hang on the bar for the duration of time that 21 pull-ups would take?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool.
Good point.
Can you hang and keep your shoulders in a good position? Cool. Can you hang and keep your shoulders in a good position and be in one of your gymnastic shapes? Okay, what about the other one? Okay, what about both of them? What about cycling both of them? And so we don't think about like the progressive nature can't be based only around load. It needs to be understanding sequences of building skill and development and movements. And so maybe
I
that
like
helps a little bit, is to look at like the same way we would look at like, hey, you've got your hook grip, you've got the position of your feet, you've got your start position, you've got, you know, first, second, and third pull, you've got your catch. We stand it up, and we look at through the course of a weightlifting cycle where we're just trying to benefit 3 attempts at a snatch, 3 attempts at a clean and jerk. You'll see people run through, you know, in a 12-week cycle, how many different snatch variations are there? I don't even know. I
counts.
can't count that high.
Right.
I am a mediocre exerciser. I'm not a scientist. But yeah, you've got like high hang, low hang, you've got tempos, pauses, behind the neck. You've like literally every piece of it is segmented to figure out like where the deficiency is, what the issue is, what the lowest hanging fruit for improvement is. And then in a deloaded structure, we build it back up
Mm-hmm.
correctly, but the shapes never change, the range never changes, the sequence never changes. We just figure out what we have to do to actually make the improvement. So what I would caution and advise people is like the same way I just broke apart the kipping, pull-up, and Fran, look at isolating all of the individual pieces in any gymnastic movement and just training them one at a time and identifying where's the issue and what do I need to fix.
Yeah. It's very. I mean, I'm big guilty of that as well. It's easy to see the pull up as just it's the pull up, and it's this one big thing that lives, and it's never actually deconstructed into its individual parts to maybe see where's the squeak that needs a little bit of grease.
Yes. And so we present kind of a model and a framework at the seminar that I think
Let's say that one more time.
test 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 test.
I got you. Yeah, I lost
Okay,
for a
weird.
second.
Yeah, it said that I was stopped, but I never lost you. So, all right, framework adventure time. Do you see all of my nice little height here? So this is the one everybody's familiar with: mechanics,
Indeed.
consistency, intensity. We will add to that. So in the original video, some of you guys were with us in the garage before we lost it, but we won't rehash all of it. What I do want to talk about is the basic sequence in which humans develop movement. So they crawl, and then they walk, and then they jog, and then they run.
And we can apply that to our body weight movements as well.
backwards. I don't know if this is going to label backwards for you. So we would figure out, there we are, in this order, mobility, skill, or strength. And what we're doing is we're trying to assess the greatest deficiency, what our biggest issue is. Because if I can't even get in the position, you can't skill work me there, you can't make me strong there. Reference it all back to like weightlifting. Like if you can't get into an overhead squat with a piece of PVC, I can't do a whole lot of overhead squat skill work or strength work until we figure out the absolute lowest level of the position. So if we identify that mobility is the issue, or whatever the issue is that we identify, we would work first isometrically. Because building our way up in momentum, velocity, and complexity, we know that like that's about a child learning to squat. They build the bottom of the squat as an isolated fixed static position. They build standing as an isolated fixed static position. So they've got them isometrically, and then they move from the top to the bottom, loading under gravity to figure out what muscles need to lengthen, what contractile function we have, what are our tendons doing, what are our ligaments doing, where are the joints. Sweet. And then we can finally put it together concentrically. So wherever we identify an issue in this, whether the limitation is mobility, skill, or strength, we will always work on tackling it first isometrically. Because if we move into eccentric, then we're dealing with load. And if we move into concentric, then we're dealing with like velocity and load, right? So unless we can just figure out like the basic positions at the lowest level, we're doomed. So once we figure that out, then we use CrossFit's absolutely perfect framework of mechanics, consistency, intensity. So can you do the thing? Can you do it again and again and again? Now we graduate into intensity. Outstanding. And guess what we do? Now we reset. So we reclaimed all of your mobility. Isometrically, we built mechanics, consistency, intensity. Then we did the same thing with eccentric. We built mechanics, consistency, intensity. Then we finally did it with, I'm trying to go backwards. It's like reverse mirror. It's like a mirrored mirror. And then we go concentric.
But Chuck, this seems like it would require patience, and I would like immediate results.
Well, I mean, how much money you got, brother? I'll sell you anything.
Yep. No, you're right. I mean, you can do it quickly or you can do it right. The choice is yours, and that's kind of why I wanted to speak with you, is to hopefully get people on a better path, on the right path, on a more efficient path, quicker than I know I did.
On a path that keeps this in mind, dude. Like, yes. Where do we lose sight of that? Everybody wants to check little RX boxes on the board, but like, wouldn't you rather be able to do a workout with your great grandkids?
There are things that only become apparent as the decades pass. And yes, the answer is yes. And ideally, we can communicate to some people who are potentially in an earlier season of their life that they may be doing things to be whiteboard heroes now that are not serving them well in the decades to come.
I concur. And I think that that's, for the coaches, that like, as a coach, that is part of like the obligation of your role, is to have these conversations with your clients. But it's also something like the athlete is always responsible for themselves. And there needs to be some amount of personal like ownership that goes into like your experience with like fitness and your journey with your body and what you're going to do with it. And in the other video, we talked for a little bit about like looking at longer timelines for goals. And you'd ask like, if I did it all over again, if I had a magic time machine and I could go back and talk to myself day one, the most important conversation I could ever have with myself about fitness would be like, give yourself the ability to be healthy and fit and do the workouts that you love and engage in this for the rest of your life. And there is no rush. And I think it's important for people to recognize that like the rush is an illusion of your ego.
Mm-hmm. The ego is a pesky critter.
That bastard. And so, yeah, like that would be my biggest piece, is just like a longer timeline for all of it and enjoying the process. But then like getting some coaching and education, because if you can really make sense of that, everything in like basic strength conditioning is done. And then past that, all you have to deal with is like, to work on progressively developing them. Oh, and we got a really good comment from somebody. It takes years to teach some of our gymnasts basic movements perfectly to keep the higher level movements safe. Slow is steady. That is awesome. We talked earlier about like basic.
Regularly.
Shit, Rock. Who am I to be better than just like standing around like working on the shape of my hand? Stand like nobody is better than the basics. And so in our rush for progress, we avoid the one thing that'll actually allow us to get there.
You know, just how you broke down things, how you built them back up, I think is gold, and both athletes and coaches will get a lot from that. And I'm always a fan of having a long-term vision, making good decisions that you're working out not for months, but literally for decades. I'm looking out the window of my house at the wind and blowing the trees, and I have a terrible fear that the video is going to get cut off again. So I want to give you one question to kind of wrap it up with, because what you just said there was a nice encapsulation of a lesson learned from an athlete perspective of, hey, you're in no rush. Take your time and do it right. So let's end with one, which is, what would be your recommendation for a coach? And specifically, I love your position where you weren't doing gymnastics since 4 years old. This wasn't your background. So you've got a lot of coaches who are highly intimidated to teach gymnastics that they didn't grow up learning. What's your advice to them?
Same. Nobody is better than the basics. And you've been around long enough to like meet some incredible coaches, like world class, like truly the best coaches on earth. And it's just like Glassman outlined in the article in Virtuosity in the L1 study guide, that like the curse of the novice is the race for complexity and the sexy stuff. And that exists for coaches and athletes. And the absolute best coaches that I know in any field, it is just ruthless, endless, brutal refinement of the most basic, simple things. It is wax on, wax off. Like, you are Mr. Miyagi. And it almost seems too simple. And people confuse that for too easy. And I think that like the lesson learned in anything in life is like being able to understand that those tiny, simple pieces replicated endlessly is what unlocks true like mastery and improvement. So as coaches, you need to build that into the culture and community of your gym. And that is something that is an entirely separate skill set on its own, that people understand that like, dude, there's no gold stars up on the top of the rings. Coach doesn't love you more if you bust out some muscle ups. Like, coach wants you to listen and feel good and be able to enjoy the shit out of your other 23 hours a day. And I think that for coaches, it's important to correlate the difficult conversations. And by the way, you need to be having difficult conversations. If you are a coach and you work with people that you actually claim to care about, there need to be hard conversations on a regular basis, because that's how everybody grows. And so having the harder conversations with your clients to get them to really understand that like the risk and reward curves that they normally pursue in gymnastics, holy shit, man, like what does that mean to your family? Like what does that mean to your wife? What does that mean to your kids? And if that seems abstract right now, everybody wants a muscle up. Cool, they should. That is like, that puts you in a percent of a percent of a percent of humans who will ever walk the earth. And like, that is fucking special. But if your first muscle up tears 2 labrums, is it super sweet? And then like people normally go to like, well, that would really mess up my training. And I'm like, hey buddy, tell me about your disability insurance. And they're
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't have any. Cool, tell me about your health insurance. Barely covered. And I think that like one of those hard conversations that needs to happen in our community and in our gyms is like, are people making decisions that they are prepared for the consequences of if it does not go well?
Oh no, no,
And I think that
you
we
don't think
think
about if it
very
goes poorly.
we think like very like myopically and like this very small viewpoint. I'm like, dude, talk to your clients about their health insurance. That's
Yep.
important. Talk to your clients about their disability insurance. That's important. And those become very, very strong non-negotiables to talk to them about like making the right decision, not for themselves, but for their families, for their loved ones, for their employers, for their employees. Because if and when you get fucked up, and you will, not because CrossFit's dangerous, but because we're dumb and our egos are big, the training that you're missing will be the least of your worries when you can't tie your shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever like grenaded your back on some ugly squats or heavy deadlifts, you're like, sure enough, man, there is nothing worse than trying to get out of the car with a herniated disc.
Right.
Been
I,
there, learned all the lessons the hard way.
I was going to say, circling back to what you said a second ago, with a lot of those hard conversations will be somehow tied to ego and wanting to go too much, too soon, too fast, too heavy, too quick, too advanced, too whatever it is. Progressions are for suckers. I don't want to modify this. I got it. Put me in, coach. And you got to say, not under my watch, my friend, because I want you back here next week and next year, healthy and happy.
Ooh, you gave me a good one on that. So a good talking point. So just to make it like, I think very actionable and tactical for coaches with like short order stuff, for all of the athletes that don't want to do any scaling or progression work, help them understand that like that's the percentage work of gymnastics.
Mm,
And they would never expect to progress their snatch just trying heavy singles all day, every day. And you're like, well, what do? You isolate where the position goes wrong. You look at what your limitation is and you tackle it with an incremental load that allows you to make progress. So for the coaches, that is my easiest piece of advice is sell to your athletes based on what you've already proven to work through weightlifting. Because then
nice.
it's not abstract, it's not foreign. You're like, hey, whoa, whoa, whoa. I know you don't want to do this, but didn't we teach you to deadlift and overhead squat before we tried to put it together in snatch? And they're like, well, yeah. And they're like, well, why would this be any different? It's just your brain and your body learning movements. Brushing your
Absolutely.
teeth, snatching a barbell, driving a car, these things are far more similar than dissimilar. We just don't appreciate that.
I think that will be exactly what you said, useful and actionable for coaches. So before the tornado or whatever is here kills my internet one more time, let's leave with how can people contact you? How can they find out about the seminars that you put on? Give them your information.
So at the Gymnastics Course on Instagram, which is our main social media piece for the community, it's just easy visual communication of media pieces. We can. Somebody dropped a big one. Can you talk about coach's ego? That's a big problem in the gymnastics community. Yes. For Kevin, at Chuck Bennington, that's me. Shoot me a DM and give me some context, and I will flesh it out in as long of a video as I need to be beneficial for you. But back to the first piece, at the Gymnastics Course on Instagram, just thegymnasticscourse.com on the web. We are back to doing seminars in a
Nice.
COVID world, and it's been a big retooling of, like we'd mentioned, like spotting. As awesome as it is in gymnastics, doesn't work in COVID, so we rewrote the course curriculum to be a contact-free course based on individual progression and self-spotting, which I
Nice.
think makes it infinitely more usable for your average coach taking it back in their box. Because as awesome as it is for me, Pat, to teach you how to spot a muscle up, it's pretty hard when you got like a class of 15 doing Amanda. So
Right. Right.
being able to like revamp the whole curriculum to give people tools to like, no matter the size of your group, individually, all of these people can work on something that is appropriate that also abides by how your physiology and your neurology actually work. So I think we've got an incredible course that's really rooted in a special combination of both science and evidence. Man, I'd love to see people out at the course, but yeah, you can message me directly at Chuck Bennington, and I'll do whatever I can to help any of you guys, all of you guys, because you do what I truly believe in my heart of hearts is the most important job on earth.
Chuck, I appreciate the information. I appreciate you being flexible enough to come back after we lost the entire first video. That was amazing of you. And hopefully this is one of what will be more conversations.
Yeah, man, I know that gymnastics is the biggest struggle that exists in our community for coaches and athletes. And so I mean it very literally, like anything I can do to be helpful to you guys, your community, yourselves, like please don't hesitate to reach out. I want everybody to be able to do muscle ups at 80 with their great grandkids. That's the perfect world to me.
I'm in. Well, once again, thanks, brother. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
All right, man. Thank you so much.
Later.
Bye.